I've never moderated before, but I guess I'm just going to ask some questions so I guess you guys can understand sort of what each of us do, really what a stylist is, you know, fashion director, fashion writer. I guess I'll just start. I'll start with Horatio. I guess if you want to just talk about maybe how you got started, and was it fashion that you love? Was it writing that you love? Sort of which came first?
I had to think about this. I've been doing it since about 1912. It was a while back, but I started when I was about 17, I want to say, and even then I had a very voracious appetite for fashion magazines. I grew up in Australia, and I'm pre-internet age, so therefore to bridge the sort of tyranny of distance that we had, you know, we're on the other side of the world, I gobbled up magazines, every single magazine, whether it was a Croatian Elle or Greek Cosmopolitan or, you know, Lithuanian Vogue, whatever, you know. I really gobbled it up and really made it my business to know as much as I could about both the current scene, and that led to also reading a lot about old school designers, you know, so going back to basics. And I think when I was about 17, I won a fiction competition for a teen magazine called Hero. And I wrote a masturbatory ode to Billy the Kid as a poem, which won. And part of that involved, I got some really crappy CDs, like a Sting. I don't even know if we had CDs in the records, but I got some Sting, some Bob Dylan, and then but one of the prizes was getting to review bands and the occasional CD. And then I won another competition, but, you know, that sort of parlayed into another thing. And then I worked at the Australian Women's Weekly, which was actually a monthly, but for obvious reasons they didn't want to call it the Women's Monthly. So I worked there as a copy boy for about 3 to 6 months. And my jobs involved distributing the food after it had been tested in the kitchen, and anything they gave me, I was, you know, a very sort of eager participant. And then towards the end of college, I was doing nothing to do with publishing. I did political economy of women, because I was the only guy, basically, so I thought I'd get good marks. And then I was offered a full-time job at the end of college by the magazine that I'd been freelancing for about 3 years. So I quit college. I never went back. That was my break. And then, you know, I clawed my way to the top, sort of, you know, backstabbed everyone, and here I am.
Stepped on people going up. And Rebecca, how did you get started? Or
I actually moved to New York under the guise of being a performer, as Rebecca had stated earlier. And I actually found myself assisting very early 90s, late 80s. I found myself working with like David LaChapelle, who was my neighbor, who had no clue, and he was actually helping me build my characters for my performing. And interesting enough, I mean, I started to design the costumes, do the props, create the entire ambiance, and this led me into actually assisting when I didn't really even realize that styling was a job. I had no idea. I had no background in fashion. I had no clue. I didn't know you could actually make money doing what we do. I didn't know. I was very, very naive, and it started out as a very natural occurrence. We just started to create these characters, and from these characters I then could look at a model or another character that was working in the downtown scene. I had actually moved to New York with RuPaul and all of these very Atlanta. I'm from the South originally, and you know, I had all these really wonderful characters all around me who were living and breathing fashion, but I didn't really think of it as fashion. It was just that's who they were, and so I sort of found myself into this mix and we started to create characters, and we started to work together and build images. And so when I got my first job, my first rotten television job as PAing, which I ran around, schlepping garment bags in the garment district on the subway, which was completely hideous, but that is our job, and still is my job 20 years later. I'm still doing it. This is now I have a car. But it really developed as a very natural way of being. It was just something I was interested in. I wasn't really that interested in fashion. I was more interested in creating characters. My fashion bug, if you will, really came with Sex and the City. I really hadn't been that interested. I don't read fashion magazines. I really just, I look at people, and people inspire me, and I try to parlay that into what I do every day. And if it's a cosmetic ad or if it's a celebrity, it's always worked for me, I guess because of my theatrical background. But I'm sort of new to fashion. I don't really consider myself I don't really think of my job as a fashion. It's just really developing characters and creating as much madness as I possibly can. I don't know.
Just want to make sure I wasn't the only one who was still schlepping garment bags 20 years
Honey,
later.
we still all schlepping a garment bag.
Dan?
Well, you know, I'd always been interested in fashion, but I never studied fashion. I never, I grew up in Kansas City, so you know, I remember the early days in the early '80s, late '70s, trying to figure out how in the world all these beautiful clothes got into GQ, and where they were sold in Kansas City, which was like, you know. So we would go to all the beautiful old department stores, which then there were many beautiful old department stores in Kansas City. But you know, I've always been a journalist, and you know, through high school I was always interested in journalism and writing, and then I studied. I have a journalism degree from the University of Missouri, Columbia. And so I never.
You just have to speak up a little
okay.
more. So.
Well, I never
All
really.
of us.
I never really was sure how one melded a fashion career with a journalism career, because no one ever told me. So, you know, I decided that I was going to work at Fairchild. I decided that I wanted to work for Women's Wear Daily, or DNR. I was actually more interested in DNR at the time because DNR was a daily, and it was pretty much like Women's Wear Daily, with all the same kind of, you know, scoops, but from the men's industry. And that's where I decided I wanted to work. Well, I didn't get there quite yet, but long story short, I ended up in New York. A friend of mine who was on Broadway said, "Oh, why don't you come and hang out with me and my girlfriend in New York, and we'll hang out and have fun." Well, he went on tour. I didn't have anywhere to live. I didn't have a job. I didn't have any money. So I had to get a job. And my first job, I wrote a weekly column for a newspaper that was called a Chemical Marketing Reporter. And I was the drugs and fine chemicals editor. So I had to write a weekly column about the drugs and chemical market. Now, that was great because the thing that I learned is that, you know, if you are a writer and you're writing about market, you can write about anything. It doesn't matter whether it's shoes, whether it's buttons, whether it's chemicals. So it was an amazing experience writing on an IBM Selectric with whiteout and, you know, and really learning, you know, how to churn out copy. In the meantime, before I got this job, I had walked in off the street at Fairchild when Fairchild was right over here. And I walked in because I didn't know. No one told me how you're supposed to go about getting a job, so I just walked in, and oddly enough, the director of human resources met with me, and she looked at my resume, and she said, "Well, you know, the only job that's available is the assistant to Patrick McCarthy." And that was, you know, before this chemical marketing job. And, you know, at that time, there were no jobs in New York City. There were no apartments. There was nothing. I said, I'll take it. She said, "You'll hate it." Long story short, she remembered me when I saw an ad for their home furnishings trade, which is, I think it's called HFN now, but was HFD at the time. And when I called her, she'd remembered me, and it was one of those instances where people say, "Oh, we'll put your resume away, we'll remember," but she remembered me. And so I got the job. It was, I had the 10 years I was at, almost 10 years I was at Fairchild. Couldn't believe I was being paid to do what I was doing. I wasn't being paid very much, but it was a lot of fun. And then I worked in children's. I was senior editor of Children's Business Magazine. That's where I started doing a little more styling, apparel styling. covering all the kids categories. And then finally, after trying so hard, I broke into DNR, and truly that was a job that, my beat, I was features editor, and my beat was going to parties every single night with a camera, taking pictures, and having daily copy. And so this was when it was a daily, and it was just the most amazing job ever. And then, 7.5 years ago, Maxim came after me. I didn't want to go. I was happy where I was. People said, "Why in the world would you go to this magazine? It's nothing. It's never going to be anything. It's never." I'm like, well, I always feel like, if there's some kind of opportunity, or you can't have any regrets in life. So if you're young enough and you have time enough, and I said, well, why not? And so I took the job, and it's, that's where I'm still there.